Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matt here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokémon TCG Pocket metagame, and we take a look at everything that's going on in the competitive side of Pokémon TCG Pocket. Should be a very interesting one. So this is actually our second meta report of this new format, and last week's Meta Monday was really interesting for a variety of reasons. Whenever meta games and formats are brand new, it's always really fun to see sort of what decks are kind of taking off or, maybe not doing so well or doing really good early on. But honestly, my favorite meta reports are the second weeks of the new format because that's when we really see, the truth, I think, or a lot closer to the truth than we see in that first week. And, this week it's going to be very, very interesting. So this week, the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly Tournament, $400 prize pool, we had about 900 players playing, which again is still really good if you consider how many people are participating in ranked mode, right? Trying to grind to Master Ball rank. I did get there recently, but I don't typically have enough time to compete in the tournaments on the weekend, but it's still a large sample size and should be very, very interesting to take a look at. So first and foremost, what we're going to do here is take a look at the metagame tab where we have all of the metadata for all of the decks that were played in this week's tournament. So let's get right into it. And the first thing that we're going to notice here is that a lot of these decks are not doing extremely well from an average win rate perspective. In fact, realistically, the number one most played deck here with Giratina and Darkrai, which was about 14 or 15% of the meta share, had a 50% win rate almost exactly. 357 wins, 342 losses, and 15 ties. So ended up being 50% on the dot, which is actually really interesting. I say it all the time, decks that see more play typically end up closer to 50%. That's just sort of how it goes. But 15% meta share is still quite a bit, 129 people playing it. But right behind Giratina and Darkrai is Giratina and Mewtwo, which had a 13% meta share and was just under 50% win rate, 289 wins, 301 losses, 6 ties. So I think realistically, the format right now, just at a quick glance, is definitely shaping around Giratina decks, in the sense that I think if you're not playing these two Giratina decks, you're probably playing other decks that you hope have good matchups against both of the Giratina decks that are at the top of the metagame, right? Other than Darkrai or Mewtwo. And then if we look a little bit closer, which we will do in a little bit, where we take a look at the top placing deck lists, we'll see that the actual 20 card lists for these Giratina decks are actually changing quite a bit, again, to cater both the matchups against the other Giratina decks, but also, your matchups against things like Gyarados, like Charizard, like Meowscarada, Gallade, and the like. So a lot is actually changing. In fact, I think a lot of things are different in the way that people are playing decks from last week to this week. And again, we'll dive right into that in a little bit, but the top two decks here, Giratina in terms of most played, however, they're both very close to 50% win rates. However, if we go down to Gyarados, which was 11% of the meta share, this is really the only deck amongst any of the decks that saw a considerable amount of play that had, I would say, like a favorable sort of, average win rate for this tournament. 285 wins, 240 losses, 9 ties. That's 53.37% win rate. So quite a bit higher than, again, all of the decks that we're going to see below, which, again, were all under 50%. And this is not something that I think maybe a lot of people expected. It's a stark difference from the last format or even the format before, where we really had maybe, a top meta contender that I think was heads above like all of the other decks, and then we had maybe like the top counter to that deck, which also saw a lot of play, but also won a lot. This format is extremely different. In fact, I think that the format right now that we're playing in is incredibly balanced, but also just massively spread out. I think that there's a large amount of decks that are actually really high quality and deserve to see play, and I think that we're going to see an even distribution, not amongst, not only a distributed amount of people playing those decks, but the success that they're having from an average win rate perspective. Now, the other thing that I say all the time is that, average win rate doesn't really mean everything, right? I think that especially early on in the format, average win rate really just kind of points to how many people believe that the deck is good. It doesn't necessarily mean that, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that's playing that deck is very experienced with that deck or is playing, a 20 card list that I think is probably, the most correct, right? So it's tough. I think there's a lot of variation in what we could consider sort of the top decks right now, but also a lot of variation in the way that those decks are seeing play, which we'll take a look at. But yes, Gyarados did do pretty well. I think that there's one significant reason for that, which I believe is likely the decline in fighting decks, because a lot of the people that were playing Gallade and Hitmonlee or even Rampardos Gyarados, really all of these fighting decks with Hitmonlee, which of course is a good counter to Gyarados, I think a lot of those players have swapped off of those decks for, in favor of something like Meowscarada, which I think is certainly seeing quite a bit of play still. It was the 5th most played deck here. Excuse me, with Beedrill. Just again, a little bit under 50% here, 133 wins, 143 losses, 6% meta share. But if we go down here, we see that there are quite a bit of other Meowscarada decks here. Executor Meowscarada, 13 people playing it, 40% win rate. Arceus Meowscarada, also 46% win rate. And if we go down here, Wigglytuff and Meowscarada, which was a very interesting inclusion to this format this week. A lot of people playing this list that I thought was really, really fun. Small sample size here, 52%, but that's 37 and 34. Again, very, very interesting. We'll take a look at that deck in a little bit. But yeah, so realistically, all of the decks, like within the top 10 most played decks, all of these decks were just below 50% win rate, other than, again, a few small examples like Gyarados here, which, again, realistically was the only deck that had above a 50% win rate that saw a decent amount of play. And again, another big reason I think for that is that Gyarados has started to include Giant Cape. In fact, if we take a look at the deck lists, which we will in a little bit, I think the only, commonly played deck list that was a bit ahead of the curve this week in terms of a deck building perspective was Gyarados. And a big reason for that was the inclusion of Giant Cape in the lists, which gave it a much better matchup against these, Giratina decks, which I think is definitely really interesting. And then if we go down here, Darkrai and Greninja continues to actually sport a pretty decent win rate. Only 27 players, but they did go 71 and 65. But again, basically all of these other decks here in the top played decks were below 50% win rate. And realistically, what that means is that, there wasn't a clear contending deck that did better than every other deck this week. But if we go down to some of these really smaller sample size decks, we see that a lot of them actually did pretty well. Like this Meowscarada and Wigglytuff list here with 10 players went above 50%. Palkia and Manaphy actually 21 and 16, and if we go down here, Rampardos, Hitmonlee 19 and 14. So there's actually quite a bit of decks here that didn't see a lot of play from a player participation perspective, but actually had really good records that ended up beating a lot of the top played decks at the top of the meta share, which again is just a really interesting observation. So yeah, taking a look at this, again, this is just one tournament, so we can't derive like an incredible amount of information from this, but what we can basically derive from this data, at least this week in the Ursa Days tournament, is that as things stand in the format, it is extremely well balanced. I think that a lot of different decks are considered really, really good. They all have pretty balanced matchup spreads against each other, maybe except for Gyarados right now, which, is still Gyarados. It has its consistency problems, but I think Gyarados is probably still the one deck that, maybe people just aren't choosing to counterplay as much or accounting for as much. And as we see here, it kind of ran away a little bit, at least on the win rate perspective. But yeah, we have about 6, 7, 8 decks, I think, right now that are all extremely good, like kind of contending here in top tier. But none of them are really running away with it, at least yet. Very balanced metagame, and I think basically what that means is that a lot of the results that we're going to see here kind of do fall under less of a matchup perspective, but fall a little bit more under experience and quality of play for the players that are participating with these decks, right? I think that all of these decks in the top are really good, but the reason that they're below 50% win rate is because, all of the players with more experience and players that maybe got a little bit more lucky, but realistically were better at playing their deck, ended up doing better in the tournament. So really interesting. So that's the metagame tab. One of the strangest metagame tabs that I've ever seen in an Ursa Days tournament, if I'm being 100% honest with you. But now let's go ahead and take a look at the standings, and we'll get into the deck lists, and then we'll talk a little bit about, the final standings for this tournament. So here we go, 3, 2, 1. These were the final standings of the Ursa Days tournament. And as we see here, Bixie here from Singapore went 12 wins, 0 losses, and 2 ties. So basically in 14 games, he didn't lose any games, although he did tie twice with Giratina and Darkrai EX. However, one thing that I do just want to note here is that Judy, I believe is how you say it, from the United States, this guy who's been streaming an incredible amount, if you don't know who this is, one of the top 10, I think, place, totals in ranked mode right now in Pokemon Pocket, has been grinding Mewtwo Giratina so much. He's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games played in ranked mode, basically all with Mewtwo and Giratina. As I followed him, went 13-1. So second place, technically, he did lose to Bixie here in the finals, but basically had more wins than anybody else in this tournament and more total points, right? So if you look at it from a record perspective, this player here playing Mewtwo and Giratina was actually the most successful deck of the tournament, not losing all the way, went on a 13-game win streak and then ended up losing in the finals, which is just an incredible run for Mewtwo Giratina. And then we see tons of Gyarados players here. So Gyarados really did kind of find its way to the very top here of day 2. I think beating out most of these other decks here that, again, were mostly Giratina decks, as we see a lot of Giratina Darkrai down here, a couple Giratina Mewtwo. Giratina Mewtwo did get 2nd place, but it also got 5th place. Giratina Darkrai here with 8th place. Not a lot of Meowscarada here at the top of the standings here. Meowscarada Beedrill did go 9-2. Zelos here from the United States got 9th place. And if we go down a little bit here, another Darkrai and Greninja. There was a Rampardos here at 19th place. Another Mewtwo Giratina. If we go down, another Rampardos, and then a couple of Beedrill Gallade decks at the bottom here of day 2, which is definitely super interesting to see. But let's take a look at the deck lists. In fact, actually, what we can do real quick before we do that is we can take a look at the metagame tab, and these are basically all of the decks that made it into day 2, so and the distributions of them. So it's going to follow probably exactly what the overall meta share was for the tournament. The majority of them here, Giratina and Darkrai, 16 of them, 11 Giratina Mewtwo, 8 Gyarados and Manaphy, which again had by far the best win rate in Top Cut as well at 65%, other than Darkrai Greninja, which went 6-3 really. But also Palkia Manaphy went 3-1, this one player. He went pretty far, but so 8 Gyarados, 4 Meowscarada Beedrill, 4 Rampardos, 4 Gallade, 3 Darkrai Greninja, a couple Charizard, a few Meowscarada decks that are kind of all spread out, and a little bit of Arceus here at the bottom as well. So these were all of the decks that made it into Top Cut, which is definitely interesting. A very massive distribution of different decks that ended up making it into day 2, which I think is definitely really, really cool. Palkia is actually looking like a really interesting player in the format. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, back to the standings. Let's take a look at some of these deck lists here. So this is going to be the number 1 Darkrai and Giratina deck of this week's tournament here, Bixie from Singapore. And let's take a look at the list that he was playing here. So this is going to be no Druddigon, which I think is actually a trend that we're seeing. And one of the biggest, I think, changes in Dark Giratina from last week was that a lot of people are just cutting out Druddigon, either entirely or they're swapping it with maybe some other cards, which we'll see in just a little bit here. But yes, 2 Giratina, 2 Darkrai. So very similar in how the deck is constructed from a Pokemon perspective as Mewtwo and Giratina is. So again, I think that you actually get a benefit of this. I think that Druddigon can be good in particular formats, especially against more aggressive formats. But right now, that's not necessarily how the format is. A lot of decks are sort of, rampy, and they like to sort of, sit back and kind of build up for a while. So things like Druddigon aren't necessarily super helpful, especially in the mirror match or going against Mewtwo and Giratina. They can just kind of set up both of their Pokemon while you're not able to do anything in the active spot. So I think that Druddigon was really common in the format early on, and I think it was actually a pretty good choice considering, Dialga Arceus was really common at the beginning, but has fallen off dramatically. So a lot of reasons why Druddigon maybe doesn't make a lot of sense to be playing in the format right now. And again, a lot of Darkrai Giratina decks have cut Druddigon out entirely, which I do think is correct looking at the current metagame. But 2 Giratina, 2 Darkrai, 2 Research, 2 Leaf. Leaf is a really, really good card. So again, the upside here to only playing 4 Pokemon is that, we're further increasing our odds of having both of these Pokemon on the board early on, which is what we want, right? We want 1 Darkrai, 1 Giratina early on the board as early as possible. Leaf gives us some flexibility there, but when we're only playing 4 Pokemon, again, very similar to the Mewtwo list, which plays, 3 Pokemon, is that we have a ton of room in the deck to play all of these, trainer cards, which can, greatly change our ability to win certain matchups. So it gives the deck a lot of flexibility without really undermining sort of the core, aspect of the deck and what the deck wants to do. So I think that definitely less Pokemon gives this deck a lot more flexibility in how we build it and in increasing our matchups against a lot of different decks in the format. So 2 Research, 2 Leaf, 2 Pokemon Center Lady, 2 Potions. So again, I think that this being the most common deck, I think that the best way to play it right now is probably with Healing to counteract other Darkrai decks, which are still, of course, very, very common in the format. So when we're playing Pokemon Center Lady, we're playing 2 Giant Capes, we're playing 2 Potions. Basically, we're able to out-heal and outpace our opponent, which is also doing chip damage with Darkrai, right? So it really comes down to, who's able to kind of keep their HP up the longest to then, out-survive their opponent, get built up, and then take a KO while also being able to live after. So it's really, really important. I think that Potions and Pokemon Center Lady and Giant Cape are all extremely good cards in all Giratina decks, because Giratina has a lot of HP, but it takes damage after it attacks. So you basically need a lot of times Giant Cape on Giratina, unless you're going to sack it with Rocky Helmet in some scenarios. But after we attack or after we get attacked, a lot of times we're at 20 or 10 HP, so playing that potion allows us to then attack, maybe revenge KO without, going down and getting KO'd after we're attacking, right? Because we're doing 20 damage to ourselves. So if you're playing Giratina, these healing cards are massively important, and I think it just makes a lot of sense given that you're probably going to be facing the mirror match more than you're not. So Mewtwo decks are also running, PCL and Potion and Giant Cape, so I think it makes sense for, the Darkrai version of it to also be doing that. So tons of healing cards in here. One red, only one copy of red, one Sabrina, one Cyrus, two Pokeball, one Rocky Helmet. So again, we don't necessarily need as much additional damage modifiers in this deck because Darkrai is sort of that primary damage modifier, whereas in Mewtwo and Giratina, we are a little bit more reliant on having those trainer cards like Red and Giovanni to do the extra damage, but one red, one Rocky Helmet on top of the Nightmare Aura damage that we should be dealing with Darkrai, especially in longer games, really should allow us to just sort of outlast our opponent when we're playing all of these healing cards. So I think that this is a very, very good list, particularly in the mirror matchup. I still, honestly, this is my opinion, I still think that Mewtwo has a favorable matchup against Dark Giratina. I know that the data probably shows otherwise, but in my personal experience, if you're building the deck correctly and if you're playing it correctly, I think that Mewtwo actually has a favorable matchup against Darkrai and Giratina, but that's just my opinion. So that is the number one placing deck. But now let's take a look at Judy's list here, which again had technically the best record here, or the most wins at 13 wins, 39 points here. And he did get second place again on a 13-game win streak and only lost once here in finals, which is just an incredible run. Not something we really ever see in the Ursa Days tournaments, which is just really, really fun. This is a list that I have really modeled my decks after. In fact, I'm playing basically the exact same deck as this player here. And again, Judy is somebody who streams all the time. I believe he's ranked in the top 10 of points for ranked battles right now. In actual Pokemon Pocket. Like, he plays an incredible amount, and he has an incredible amount of experience with Mewtwo. So, and the way that he's building Mewtwo Giratina is basically like flex Mewtwo Giratina, right? He's basically including a ton of different cards in the deck that can potentially win him matchups against basically every deck in the format. So, two Giratina, one Mewtwo. I know some people have asked me, should we be playing two Mewtwo, or should we be playing no Mewtwo? Is just 18 trainer Giratina also good? Personally, I think that Mewtwo is basically needed for this deck to be super relevant. I think that extra 20 damage that Mewtwo can do, that's 170 with red, 190 if you're combining Rocky Helmet damage from that. So I think that Mewtwo is extraordinarily good. It also has, it doesn't do damage to itself. So even after we attack with Mewtwo, we're still at 170 HP. Most decks aren't able to revenge KO us at that number. So Mewtwo is extraordinarily good. Sometimes leading off with Mewtwo in this deck doesn't feel that great. I've covered this deck a ton, and I've actually, uploaded a lot of games of me playing this deck in ranked battles. I did another live stream on Saturday. I did one a week ago, last Saturday, and then I made an entire video where I kind of uploaded some ranked gameplay of this deck. So I've talked about it a lot, but this list here is playing a ton of one-ofs that are basically really crucial for specific matchups. And I think that that's, again, is a big reason why this list is so good, because you can kind of really customize the deck to be strong in other matchups because we have so much room for trainer cards. And the deck really just does what it wants to do. No matter what trainer cards you're playing, right, the core strategy is the same. We're just allowed to be a little bit more flexible in all of these trainer cards that we're running. So 2 Research and 2 Pokeball, as always, running 1 copy of Red and 1 Giovanni. So traditionally, Mewtwo was always running 2 copies of Red just to always get that one-hit KO on, other Darkrai's and other Giratinas. But as so many people are playing Meowscarada decks and even things like Rampardos, Red has actually become a little bit less relevant, I think, in the format right now. For a variety of reasons. I think that oftentimes we're going up against decks that aren't even really playing EX Pokemon. So I don't think we really need 2 copies of Red, and Giovanni is extraordinarily good in those scenarios. It allows Giratina to hit for 140 to KO Meowscarada, or if Meowscarada has Giant Cape, we can attack with Mewtwo and do 160 and still KO those Meowscaradas even if they have Giant Cape. So Giovanni is super good. It also is actually really good in the early game if we are leading with Mewtwo, because we can Psychic Sphere for 60 damage, taking a KO on a lot of basic Pokemon, things like Sprigatito, or even things like Hitmonlee or Marshadow, which have 80 HP, but they're weak to Psychic. So with Giovanni, we do hit for 80. So it's a really, really relevant card. One of my favorite cards to be playing in this deck. You could even, depending on how the format shifts around, if so many people are not playing, or if so many people are playing Meowscarada in the fighting decks, like 2 Giovanni could possibly be correct, but 1 Red, 1 Giovanni. This is also the combo that I'm running right now. He's running 1 Sabrina and 1 Cyrus, 1 Pokemon Center Lady, 1 Mars, 1 Dawn, 1 Leaf, and then 2 Potion, 2 Giant Cape, 1 Rocky Helmet. So every card in this deck has its place, right? Dawn allows us to be, excuse me, Sorry for the coughing. It allows us to be maybe a little bit extra aggressive in some scenarios, but what it also allows us to do is potentially attack turn after turn with Mewtwo, which is its own win condition, or even attack a turn earlier with Giratina in another win condition. It just gives us extra flexibility. A really, really good card. It's won me a lot of games. I think that Mars is also really good. I think that one copy of Mars is kind of correct. It really is our 19th or 20th card in the deck, but there's so many times where Mars does win you the game. Even in early Mars, like think about how many times you're going up against like a Charizard or whatever, and they've just back-to-back research, and they have like 9 cards in their hand, but they haven't found their Charizard because it's like turn 3. So we just play Mars. We bring them down to 3 cards, even in the early game or in the late game. Say we're going against a Meowscarada, and they have an early Meowscarada set up. You know, they attack, they KO us, but then we can revenge KO them, but they don't have a second Meowscarada setup, right? Because it's a stage 2 Pokemon. So even though they got that first Meowscarada out early and they KO our Giratina or whatever, we come in with Mewtwo, we take the KO, then we play Mars, right? We play that Mars, and basically we bring them down to 1 card and they don't have a second stage 2 Pokemon found yet. It can be really good in those scenarios as well. So I think that Mars is super good. Excuse me. And then again, Pokemon Center Lady and Potion, that combo, really, really good and valuable against really mostly the Darkrai decks, but Potion is kind of just needed, I think, in general when you're going against Giratina. Pokemon Center Lady, just super good. I think that healing is really good in the format right now, especially with all of the chip damage that we're seeing. And he's playing, again, 1 Cyrus and 1 Sabrina and 1 Leaf. Now, there's a lot of scenarios in my playtesting with this deck that I've actually wanted to play 2 copies of Leaf, but I think realistically, I think that there's only so much room. 1 copy of Leaf is really good. There's a lot of scenarios where Leaf does win us the game, for sure. And then 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus. Now, one thing that I did towards the end of my Master Ball grind was actually cut the Cyrus, and I just started playing double Sabrina. 2 Sabrinas really does kind of function in a very similar way to 1 Sabrina and Cyrus, but the thing with Mewtwo is that most of the time, you're kind of just taking one-hit KOs. Like, there's not a lot of times where, you know, we're doing like 50 damage with Mewtwo, and then you know, we're not like, and then we have to bring that Pokemon back into the active spot. There are some scenarios where that is the case, but typically, if we're playing Cyrus, it's towards the late game, and Sabrina is a card that can kind of function the same way. Anyway, the difference with Sabrina is that we can play it early on to really disrupt our opponent. It can be really good against Meowscarada decks. It can be really good against Charizard early on, or even Gyarados to bring those, you know, non-leadoff Pokemon into the active spot to get those Moltres and those Manaphy's out of there. Sabrina is super good, and again, we can attack early on turn 3 with Giratina, or we can attack turn 2 for going second with Psychic Sphere with Mewtwo. So there's a lot of scenarios where early Sabrina can win you games. So I think that in the format right now, and against all of the decks that I was seeing in ranked mode, I actually liked 2 Sabrina better than Sabrina and Cyrus. I think, again, just for a deck like this that likes to take one-hit KOs most of the time, we don't really need Cyrus, and I just haven't, I found myself not using Cyrus that much and just wanting another Sabrina, so I kind of just end up playing 2 Sabrinas, and it did work out for me, but again, that really does kind of depend on, you know, what you're going to be seeing in the metagame, right? So I think that Cyrus is good, but personally, I've been playing 2 Sabrinas, but yeah, Judy's list is, again, super flexible, and it's really kind of tailored towards all of the matchups that he's playing. It's a super, you know, kind of a spread out, kind of like balanced version of playing Giratina Mewtwo. And again, in the format right now, you're playing so many different decks. Like, you're playing Charizard, you're playing Gyarados, you're playing Meowscarada, you're playing Darkrai, you're playing the Mirror Match. There's so many games where, you know, just even having one of these cards can win you the game. So being flexible like this, and again, this is a deck that really kind of goes into the late game pretty often. You oftentimes do draw the one-ofs of most cards in your deck. So knowing what cards you need and when to use them is really valuable. So I like playing the deck like this, and this is really how I have been playing the deck. So again, Judy is an extremely experienced player. He's played hundreds of games in ranked mode with Mewtwo and Giratina, so no surprise to me that he got second place. But again, it's also no surprise to me that the 2 top decks of this tournament this week were both Giratina decks, right? Darkrai and Mewtwo. This week, Darkrai got the win, but it could have just as easily been Mewtwo this week, and it could have gone back-to-back, but I think it's kind of poetic that, you know, both Mewtwo Giratina won the first week, and then Mewtwo Darkrai won the second week. I think they really are not only the 2 most played decks in the format, but probably the most commonly played decks by top players. Now, let's get into Gyarados, because it really is kind of the elephant in the room. If we take a look here, there are 5 Gyarados here in the top 11. It was by far the most successful deck here at the top of day 2. So this player here from Japan went 10-2-1. Excuse me, I keep coughing. Oh my goodness. I gotta take a drink. Hold on. All right, sorry about that. So this player here, 10-2, the top placing Gyarados list got 3rd place, lost in top 4. this player wasn't actually playing any Giant Cape. So this was kind of still a very traditional Gyarados list. He was playing one copy of Sabrina, which I do find to be pretty interesting. 2 Misty, 2 Irida, 2 Research, 2 Pokeball, 1 Sabrina, 1 Red, 1 Pokecom, and 2 Rocky Helmets. So this was the way that people are playing Gyarados from the beginning of the format. I think that Gyarados, in most scenarios, having 180 HP is enough to kind of just live whatever. So having that extra damage modifiers with Rocky Helmet and Red, allowing Gyarados to take more 1-hit KOs, really does kind of win you the game in a lot of scenarios. Gyarados has always been kind of a high roll deck, right? It does get sort of auto, destroyed by Hitmonlee in the early game, but also early Sabrinas can really affect this deck. I think that Origin Form Palkia is still correct to play one copy of. It provides great utility. It's a good attacking option, and it can act as that buffer to use before Gyarados, which again is really, really valuable. Gyarados can also just come out on turn 2 with 4 energies if they flip heads with Misties, and then you kind of just lose the game. There's nothing you can really do there. And again, Manaphy is just really consistent. It can get killed on turn 2 from Mewtwo hitting for 50 damage, so it's interesting. But to be fair, what I was talking about earlier was that so many Gyarados players are playing Giant Cape now, which I think really does increase their probability of winning against those Giratina decks. But as we see, the top rank, or the top placing Gyarados player of this week was not playing Giant Cape. They were playing kind of a traditional, early format Gyarados deck, just really leaning into that aggression with Rocky Helmet and Red. So yeah, there it is. Gyarados did have the highest win rate this week, and I'm not super surprised by that. Next up is Frog EX Baber from France. He went 10-3. Let's take a look at his Charizard deck, and as we see here, we're playing 1 copy of Misty instead of 2, so being a little bit less RNG, sort of explosive with only 1 copy of Misty. But we are playing 1 copy of Mars to be a little bit more consistent into the late game. Still 1 Sabrina, and now 1 Giant Cape and 1 Rocky Helmet. Now, again, my personal opinion is that in the mirror matchup, Giant Cape doesn't really matter, but again, against things like Giratina, having 200 HP is a big deal because, Mewtwo with Rocky Helmet and Red can actually get enough damage to KO you. So Giant Cape really does kind of put you out of range, especially if you're going up against, Darkrai. It's a lot of chip damage. There's Rocky Helmet. So 180 isn't always enough, especially with Mewtwo and Red floating around in the format. Giant Cape really does help Gyarados survive in a lot of those Giratina matchups, but also if we're not playing against the Giratina decks and we're playing against Hitmonlee and things like that, we can throw Giant Cape on Magikarp or on Manaphy to survive, an extra turn or two, which really is the difference between us winning or losing in a lot of different scenarios. So I think that Giant Cape is kind of correct, even 1 copy of it, which might not be super consistently found. Again, in the late game, we can just attach that to Gyarados or even Origin Form Palkia to potentially take it out of range of getting KO'd by, Giratina or Darkrai, which is really, really relevant. So this is sort of how people are playing Gyarados now, and in fact, I think most people this week were playing Giant Cape in their Gyarados list, and I think that actually really had a pretty heavy contribution for Gyarados to have the highest win rate out of any of the top decks this week. But not only that, I just think that Gyarados is super strong. And I think that the format right now, initially, it did seem like all of the Hitmonlee and Gallade decks would keep Gyarados in check. But as time's gone on, less and less people are playing those fighting decks and more people are playing Meowscarada. And Meowscarada does not have a great matchup against Gyarados, as we talked about in a video a few days ago where we went through all of the matchup data. So just really interesting. Gyarados might really just still emerge as kind of that top deck. It might realistically just kind of find its way to the top of the metagame. Again, it's a little bit more RNG. It's less RNG than maybe some of the stage 2 decks like Meowscarada, but it is a little bit reliant on you finding that Gyarados early or not and not getting hit with an early Sabrina. But Gyarados is so strong, and it's probably one of my least favorite decks to go up against because I'm mostly playing Mewtwo and Giratina. Let's take a look at this 5th place, second highest placing Mewtwo and Giratina deck to see if maybe anything is different with this list here. And right off the bat here, I think the only difference is that we're playing 2 Red and not Giovanni. So again, this is a list that's going to be a lot stronger or a lot more consistent against the mirror match, against things like Gyarados, against things like Darkrai, right? The Red is really, really good. It's just that, in a lot of the matchups that you're going up against now, particularly Meowscarada, you can't really use Red. So I like 2 copies of Red. I played 2 copies of Red in Mewtwo Giratina for a very long time until Meowscarada became super popular. But, I think that Red is still an incredibly useful card. It gives this deck that much more consistency in a win condition when you're going up against other EX decks. And it's just really good to be able to go back-to-back Red. Like you attack with Giratina with Red, you take a KO KO, and then you have Mewtwo, but they have Giant Cape, and then you're like, nah, I got a second red, GG. Now, the other thing too, though, is that you can still use Giovanni against EX Pokemon. It's just 1 less HP. So 1 Giovanni, 1 red isn't even that much worse against a lot of those mirror matchup decks or against Giratina, because Mewtwo does 150, right? So even with Giovanni, it's 160. That's enough to KO Darkrai with Giant Cape, or Weavile with Giant Cape, or Giratina after it attacks you, right? So even Giovanni is still really relevant. And I think that Giovanni is probably correct right now in the format, but as we see, this list was playing 2 copies of red, and technically it is more consistent if you're not going up against those Meowscarada decks, right? So just something to keep in mind. Let's see here. There was Palkia here at 7th place that went 9-3. So Palkia had a very small amount of people playing it this week, but it actually did do really well from a win rate perspective. And this is going to be very similar to Gyarados. The upside here is that, again, we're not playing Magikarp, right? So we're not getting absolutely bodied by things like Hitmonlee. Palkia is also a pretty decent leadoff position. So I think in the format right now, hitting for 150, we aren't playing any oh no, we are. We're playing 1 copy of red. So, 150 with 1 copy of red is kind of checkmate in a lot of scenarios. Gives us a much better matchup against things like Giratina and Mewtwo, which I think is definitely really, really relevant. 170 is a very, very good number. A lot of things with 150 HP are just kind of hanging out with Giant Cape. So being able to just sort of be proactive and take the KO on them with Palkia is definitely really, really good. And yeah, I think that Palkia is actually a little bit really good in the format right now. Also, it's a basic Pokemon, so you can go turn 1 Misties into Palkia. It's got a lot of potential, and I think that this is a deck that's particularly slept on. I think that Gyarados last format was definitely a bit better than Palkia in a build like this, and I think people figured that out pretty early, but for the most part, I think that Palkia might even be like on par with Gyarados. We'll have to see. It has a smaller sample size, but I mean, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, 2 Giant Cape. It's just Palkia is Palkia, right? It's still an extremely good card, and I think that it's kind of been forgotten a little bit and kind of put to the wayside by things like Gyarados, which just seem a little bit more dominant. But I think that, as we'll see, 150 with Palkia is extremely good as a basic Pokemon, a little bit more aggressive in its potential, and it's a list that I think is actually really, really good. I think it deserves to see more play. Here at 8th place here, we have Aloe from France. A lot of France players here doing well in this week's tournament. So shout out to all the players from France doing extremely well. All of these Frog EX team players, I think is what that is, doing really, really well. Aloe here playing Greninja and Darkrai, and this is a list that I think is super interesting because we are still playing Druddigon and we are playing 1 copy of Giratina. So this is a deck that's very heavily on the Pokemon side of things. But again, a lot of the top decks in the format right now are playing a lot of Pokemon. It's not something that's I guess a surprise, even though I think that the game right now kind of rewards you for playing less Pokemon and playing more trainer cards because so many of the trainer cards are so good. In a strategy like Darkrai, Greninja, and Druddigon, it's just really consistent in the late game. It's so much extra damage. Giratina also really, really good. It's just all about being extremely annoying into the late game, and I think most games now are actually going into the late game, which really does kind of help you in a lot of different scenarios. So this is a list that has consistently been placing well. The average win rate for Greninja and Darkrai is as high as really any other deck at the top of the metagame, even though it's not necessarily one of the most played decks, and I think that a lot of people are just choosing to play Darkrai in other ways. But no, Greninja, Druddigon, Darkrai, extremely good combination right now, especially since the format is so ramp focused and decks are so much slower than they otherwise are. So shout out to Aloe there. Really, really fun list. And then all the way down here at 9th, we've got, I say all the way down, but at 9th place, we've got the highest ranking Meowscarada deck. And this is what people are kind of playing, I think, for the most part when you're playing Meowscarada. I've seen some people play it with, Executor. Some people are playing it with Arceus and Carnivine. Some people play Meowscarada with Magnezone. So there's a lot of different ways. And I think that some are better in other matchups. But I think the cool thing about this Meowscarada deck is that you have the potential to go turn 3 Beedrill, which is just absolutely terrifying. We're playing the old Weedle, which I think is correct because we're only playing 1 copy of Weedle, so we don't need the other one to find an additional Weedle in our deck. But yeah, Beedrill is kind of its own win condition if you do get it set up on turn 3. If not, we can go back-to-back Meowscarada, then go into Beedrill. So as far as like high roll potential goes, right? If this particular deck finds all of its Pokemon, right? Theoretically speaking, if you just get all of your Pokemon evolved by turn 3 or turn 4, like you're not going to lose the game because all of your Pokemon attack for a low energy cost, and they're all stage 2 Pokemon with a lot of HP that are just super annoying. And Beedrill is super annoying, especially when it comes out on turn 3. We have Ericas, we have Reds, we have Team Rocket Grunt to extend that early game as well. 1 Giant Cape. Now, I think a big skill ceiling with this deck is when and where to put our Giant Cape on in what matchup. So yeah, this is a list that, again, probably feels a little bit less consistent just based off of how many evolution Pokemon are in the deck. We're playing 3 basic Pokemon, and we're playing, what is this, 2, 4, 5, 6 evolution Pokemon. So that ratio definitely would kind of tell you that the deck isn't as consistent as some of the other decks, but if it does draw the Pokemon that it needs to, it just is extremely good. And honestly, one of the more frustrating decks to play against, but again, that's why we're playing 2 Sabrina in my Mewtwo list, is what I was kind of saying before, right? But yeah, no, anyway, Meowscarada is Meowscarada. It hasn't actually had like this, like a super high win rate. It's had a very consistent win rate, but nothing like absolutely phenomenal. And again, I think all of these Gyarados really did have a good matchup against Meowscarada, so interesting to see as well. Like I said, the format's just extremely balanced. I think this week there was a slight favor bias towards Gyarados in terms of its position in the metagame and how well it did, but realistically, you know, you have the Gyarados decks or the Misty decks, you have the Darkrai decks, you got the Mewtwo deck, and then you have all of the Meowscarada decks, and you have some of the fighting decks, and I think that they're all actually really good, realistically. Below all of these Gyaradoses here in the top 12, we see a lot of Giratina and Darkrai. Again, the most common deck here, a lot of these players falling within 8 to win, 7 wins that, you know, did do really well in the tournament, but again, probably just lost in like the first round or two in day 2, which is definitely interesting, but yeah, so let's go down a little bit, and before we wrap up this video, and we'll take a look at some other deck lists here that we've yet to take a look at. If we go down a little bit here, we do have Rampardos and Lucario. So Rampardos is a deck that really kind of has just fallen like to the wayside. I think a lot of people aren't really playing Rampardos anymore, even though I think it's really, really good. For the same reason that it's immune to things like red. Unfortunately, though, like you do like take damage after you take a KO with Rampardos, but truthfully, with Lucario, with Marshadow, with Hitmonlees and stuff, we should be able to finish the game with Rampardos. And in a deck like this, we can kind of, you know, do a lot of different like flexible things here in the early game. Again, it's just a deck I think that plays a lot of Pokemon, and since we're playing fossils, we are reliant on drawing into that fossil early on, and if we don't, then we just don't get Rampardos, right? And you can also early Sabrina up a fossil, and it can't retreat, right? So if you bring a fossil up into the active spot, they either have to like evolve so that they can attack you, or they just have to discard the card, which is really interesting. It's a really interesting dynamic. Again, a big reason to play early Sabrina can be really good in a lot of matchups, but Rampardos is really good, and I think that fighting decks in general are good. I just think a lot of people are kind of choosing to play Meowscarada as far as like non-EX decks go. I like Rampardos, I do. And as well, like Gallade still exists, so I think a lot of people are probably also choosing to play Gallade more than not. But either way, yeah, Rampardos is still Rampardos, and I think it's still a relevant card and a very relevant deck in the format. If we go down a little bit, there is an Arceus and Meowscarada deck here, and this is going to be Turbo Grass Arceus with Meowscarada. This is a deck that I actually struggled a lot with on the ladder for a variety of reasons. I think that like the early aggression with Carnivine, which they always seem to be able to have Carnivine out really early on, is super annoying because 50 damage, like when you're playing like these Giratina decks that are a bit slow and they like to build up, like just getting smacked from turn 1 from Carnivine just feels really bad, and it can put a lot of crazy pressure while also taking that time to, you know, evolve up Meowscarada or set up Arceus. This deck is actually really, really good. Again, it's a little bit inconsistent in its leadoffs. The other aggro Arceus deck is playing things like Rotom and Sky Support Shaman to be a little bit more flexible in its leadoff, but I think for the most part, this deck is also really, really good. And from a win rate perspective, I think it's just about as high, maybe not this week, but overall as high as really any of the other Meowscarada decks. Again, so many different ways to play Meowscarada, and it is just so frustrating. I think the only downside to that deck there is when you lead off with Arceus, you kind of are just in a really tough spot, right? So it does kind of lack a little bit of consistency in the early game, because if you do lead with Arceus, like you just kind of lose, right? In a lot of ways, at least. And then here's Gallade. So again, Gallade didn't have a great showing this week, but I think that it could have if more people played it because of how many people played Gyarados, right? So Gallade's interesting. I think that with so much Mewtwo and Giratina running around, Gallade does feel a little bit scary because Giratina can KO you, right? Especially like with like red, and Mewtwo can 1-hit KO even without red. So Gallade feels a little bit scary, but again, very good into Gyarados and actually pretty decent into Meowscarada as well. Just a really, really good deck, and I think that it still deserves to see all the play that it is seeing play. I kind of probably have it in my top 6, top 7. It's just a lot of the decks really interact with each other at a really interesting way at the top of the metagame, and I think there's just so many choices of decks that are relevant right now. And like I said, the standings really do show that. But the thing that the standings show, honestly, is that, you know, the decks that saw more play, like, probably saw more success, right? I mean, there's a lot of Gyarados here, a lot of Giratina decks, a lot of Giratina Darkrai decks, because these were all of the most played decks. You know, when we see some Meowscarada farther down here, we see some fighting, a couple of Charizards here outside of top 32. But, I mean, realistically, like I said, there's 6 or 7 decks that are all at the top of the metagame that could win really at any given week. I think that what we're seeing though is that a few of the players that have kind of played more games than everybody else with specific decks are having a pretty distinct advantage. And again, they have the advantage of being a little bit more flexible. One thing I did want to take a look at here was this is the Greninja list. I wanted to take a look at, where is it? Did I just click on this? Oh, I did. Okay, so that's characterized as Darkrai Giratina. There's a couple of different ways people are playing Darkrai Giratina before we end the video. So this deck is again not playing Druddigon, but it's playing 1 copy of Mew, which I do think is really interesting. It can be extremely good in the Charizard matchup. Mew EX is still a good card. It's also good against Mewtwo, so kind of a counterplay to Giratina and Mewtwo, which is definitely interesting. But the other way that people are playing this list here is instead of like Mew EX, they're actually playing Arceus, which is interesting. I'll try to find an example of that if I can. That's the Mew EX deck. What's this one here? That's also just 2 and 2. If we go down here, or any playing Arceus. Yeah, okay, so here's an image of Arceus. So this is a really fun deck because we're playing Dawn in it. Now, I don't think Arceus is a very good card in this format. Like, I wouldn't consider Arceus nearly as good as all of the other Pokemon that we talk about. But the thing with Arceus is that it can attack for 3 energies, right? So when you pair it with Giratina and Dawn, like technically you can Ultimate Force on turn 3, which is really, really, really good. Or even on turn 2 sometimes, right? So Arceus EX can be extremely fast paced. Again, we can't Dawn and play Red on the same turn, so we are limited to 130 damage, and that is if our bench is full. So this deck is really interesting. It gives us sort of another flexible option. And I think that Arceus is a good card. It's just a little bit awkward with 140 HP and hitting for 130. The math just doesn't always work out. It's a little bit awkward with its breakpoints, but this is just another version that I saw that I wanted to showcase to you guys. There's actually a lot of change and flexibility happening with Giratina Darkrai, whereas in that first week, people were really kind of playing it the same way, which I think now is changing a lot, which kind of makes sense because of how evenly spaced out the format is and where we're kind of focusing our efforts with this particular deck list. So anyway, guys, that's going to be it. That's going to be our meta report this week. The one thing that I just want to wrap up this video by mentioning is that I really do think that the format is really well spaced out right now. I don't know if Pokemon Pocket has ever had a more balanced format. Again, you can kind of interpret things a lot of different ways. I know some people have been extremely successful with some decks and not very successful with the others, but I think what it really comes down to is how well you understand the deck, how well you understand the matchups with that deck, your experience with it, and your understanding of all of the matchups when you're playing a particular deck. And I think that right now, it's about as interesting of a time that we could possibly have in Pokemon Pocket to have ranked battles and to have a ranked format because, I make these videos every day and every week, and I really try to showcase as much as I can and, be as instructional and educative as I possibly can about the game because I think that it's really interesting. But I think right now, it's a lot more complex, and I think that the ability to play a deck as properly and as consistently as possible is probably your #1 advantage. I've been saying it for a while now. I think there's like 6, 7, 8 decks that I think are all really good right now, and depending on your experience with that deck and how well you understand all of the matchups against the other top decks, is probably going to be the #1 determining factor in how successful you are, and I think that we've kind of seen that as time has gone on and what we'll probably continue to see. So really, really interesting. Very interesting this week. A lot of the decks changed a lot, but again, very, very balanced, very spread out. Not something that I really expected, especially coming off of last format, which was a lot less interesting. So we're going to be covering this meta for the next 2-3 weeks, realistically, until the next set comes out. We're going to be doing our updated tier list tomorrow, which I'm really excited about. Going to get a lot of thoughts out there. But anyway, guys, let's wrap up the video here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you guys next time. Stay tuned for tomorrow and in the upcoming weeks and in days. A lot of content coming out, so I'm really excited for that. But anyway, guys, peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah, bye.